IVM.
Please note, this episode was recorded in a public space with background noise, so the audio quality is not up to our usual standards. We apologize for any inconvenience. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Anirudh, Kanisetti, a geostrategy researcher with the Takshashila Institution. I'm here on the sidelines of the ORF CyFy event in the beautiful Taj Mansingh, New Delhi. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Andre-Michel Essoungou, who is a journalist of Cameroonian origin who works with the United Nations as a political officer. I have with me as well my colleague Rohan, a technology policy specialist. So without any further ado, let's begin. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
I want to begin by asking you a little bit about how social media and the internet generally is used in Africa. I think it's something that is not generally very talked about or very well understood in India. So can you tell us a little bit about Kenya, for example? I believe Ushahidi, there's a blog that turned into an app. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, it's an interesting subject because, of course, the continent of Africa is not much in the discussion when at the international level there are discussions about technologies and their uses. What is interesting though is that interesting trends have emerged from Africa regarding the use of technology. Just let me step back a little bit. Before even the internet, mobile phone, Africa is the continent that went from the use of landline phones to mobile phones without really doing much in terms of landlines. It was estimated at some point 30 years ago that you had less landlines in the whole continent of Africa than in the island of Manhattan in New York. But 20 years on, in the continent of Africa, mobile phones have a penetration of almost 100% at this point. And that happened in the space of 10, 15 years. Similarly, the use of the internet has jumped in ways that we haven't seen anywhere else. Although at this point, 1.3 billion people are estimated to live in Africa, and only 500 million have access to the internet. 200 million of them use social media. Although these numbers look less important than in other contexts, you have to look back and realize that 10 years ago, these numbers were really low. You have 50 million people basically using internet in Africa. So every single year, the growth has been at least of 10% in the numbers of users. Similarly, and most critically, some of the big trends we've seen in recent years in the use of the internet, namely the use of mobile internet, actually were seen already in Africa 10 years ago. Partly because people didn't have access to computers, to laptops, which were very expensive. People jumped right away to the use of smartphones coming actually from Asia, from China and from India, to using internet only mostly on mobile phones, which became the dominant trend, including in the US where I live today. So as a market and as a place of the world, Africa is one of the areas where we see the most rapid growth in the use of the internet and the most innovative growth also. Now, there are challenges. In many African countries, access to internet is expensive. Actually, African countries are among the places in the world where the internet is the most expensive. It's not always that fast. And you also have the trend we see elsewhere where governments decide that the use of the internet by many people is causing problems to them, and there are limits to it. We've seen in recent months taxations coming up, taxation legislations in a handful of countries. To come back to the Ushahidi example you mentioned, this was an app developed by young Africans 10 years ago in the midst of a political crisis in Kenya. and they were trying to connect people allow people to reach out to each other, families to find their relatives and others. And this group of technology minds, young people, lawyers and others developed this app, which became a really big success and was exported beyond the borders of Kenya. It was back then the most talked about example of the use of technology by young people in Africa. It's not the only one. We've seen in recent years more and more examples, and I did write a few years ago about how African youth were using social media in particular in innovative ways, and we see more and more when I travel across Africa, we have online celebrities, YouTube celebrities, much like we see in India. It's being slower than in a country like India because obviously India has a human resources and a knowledge base that is more important, and maybe also the fact that you have one big market makes it easier than the countries of Africa, because when you compare the continent of Africa and the country of India, which is itself a continent, have the same population at this point, but you still have 52, 53 countries and laws and barriers. So interesting developments are happening on the continent. They're under the radar right now, but they are most likely coming to the forefront sooner or later. I will say actually sooner.
That's absolutely fascinating. So if I can ask you to dive a little bit into what you said, sir. So you mentioned that social media growth and just the internet generally have been increasing rapidly over the last 15 years. What's really been powering this? I'm sure there are people who actually want to use it, but have there been substantial changes in policy? Has there been a change in the global manufacturing environment that's made this possible to happen?
Well, a couple of things have happened. Of course, as you mentioned, the surprising, to a certain degree, enthusiasm shown by the African in using the internet. It's already, in fact, it was the case for mobile phones as well, because when mobile phone came out in the West and in countries in Asia, no one actually looked at Africa as a market because, of course, landline phones have not been a success. And it took a few entrepreneurs in Africa, and in fact, one big company, Airtel of India, to make the jump and invest in these markets, and to realize that in fact people in Africa as elsewhere in the world like to talk, and if they're given the tool to talk, they will do it. So that was one big driving force. But at the same time, government actually, after slowly coming to the realization that this was an area where you could get revenues, and you can enlarge your tax base, actually started changing legislations, and we saw in a number of countries regulatory agencies being created out of nowhere where they didn't exist, and they made it easier for external investors to come in. The first ones were South Africans, because South Africa had a bigger market. Then we started seeing Europeans, French and English, and Asian coming to Africa, to the point that today when you travel in most of Africa, from Northern Africa to South Africa, going to the West and the center, you actually can be roaming on the same company or a couple of companies. So the investment made by foreign big companies and the laws changed in the country to make that attractive have influenced that. What we're seeing in recent years regarding the use of internet in Africa is, I would say, two different trends, contradictory. On one hand, many governments are going forward, and they have, like the government of Rwanda or the Seychelles, open their countries even more to a better connection to the internet. I think Rwanda, the Seychelles, and a couple of other countries are now connected to the fiber optic network, which goes across Africa. So we see this kind of openness from certain governments who have made it. I've realized how much they can gain from this. Then you have the other trend, which is contradictory, where you see government trying to limit the use of the internet. It's particularly true in countries where, of late, political protests have been driven strongly by social media. We've seen it in the so-called Arab Spring in Northern Africa, where really it was through Facebook and Twitter that people mobilized and toppled governments.
And also more recently in Sudan.
And most recently in Sudan. One of the backfire from that is that soon thereafter you have government thinking maybe we will limit access. But this trend will be hard to sustain because there is a realization that the internet brings many things. One of them for state coffers money through taxation. It opens opportunities. It adds values. And that if you don't move fast enough, well, you might not benefit from what it has to offer. So across Africa, you see these trends and I'm fascinated every time I travel around the world that they're not much mentioned, but they're actually happening. They're happening fast in certain contexts.
So you talked about Airtel, and I remember that when Airtel tried to launch a payments bank in India, RBI, our Reserve Bank, said that mobile companies that launch payment services become banks first. I think that was the infamous quote at the time. And then I remember Airtel moved to Kenya and got the authorization to start the payments bank over there. And so I just wanted to get your view on this in terms of fintech and financial inclusion. Is the spirit of approving innovations in fintech still prevalent in Africa when you look at tech like Libra or other financial inclusion technologies that could
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question because when you talk about fintech in Africa or the use of mobile money, Kenya comes to mind because an experiment has been very successful there. It's called M-Pesa. It was started by a local company, Vodacom, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And it worked so well because it managed to bring into the formal economy those who were unbanked. And in fact, in most of Africa, even more than in India and most of Asia, the majority of the population in many countries doesn't have access to a bank account. So these companies had a big opportunity, and in Kenya it worked so well. In my home country, in Cameroon, recently, over the past 5 years, it's been equally a success because quickly they were able to tap into the young people who are out of school or getting out of school and will be starting looking for jobs and who are already using the internet for many things. So this is one of those success stories developing, because from Kenya we saw the same thing in West Africa. It was already the case in South Africa, which in the continent of Africa is a leading force in the use of internet, but it's also a very special because of a different history and the strength of its economy. So this is, yes, one area where things have dramatically changed, but also because really there were customers to be had, and that's what's happening, yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about, so you briefly touched upon the fact that some countries are wholeheartedly embracing the whole idea of social media because of the sheer economic potential that it has. But you also have countries that are clamping down on social media. Can you tell us a little bit about how African countries are going about this? I believe there's a lot of paranoia, especially in some analysts I've seen in the West, about China getting into the African Union, for example. What are your thoughts on the matter, sir?
Well, I mean, some of the debates you hear when you're sitting in the West, and in my case, I live in New York, are very interesting because when you transfer them to the continent of Africa, it always feels like deja vu, or it's still far but not that far away. And this is the case particularly with the presence of foreign actors in the area of the internet. So the debate, for example, around Huawei right now, and this dispute ongoing with Western countries, and especially the US. Well, seen from Africa, a few years ago, I think it was 2005 or 6, I was living in Uganda, and the internet was really crappy. In the space of 2 years, it was thanks to investment by Huawei that most people got their first access to the internet.
In 2 years?
Yes, in the space of 2 years. And they came with this mobile modem you could just plug on your computer. So if you ask people living in Uganda today what's the view of Huawei, they will only have a positive view of Huawei because that's how they access the internet for the first time. Similarly, most of the cell phones sold in Africa, in many countries in Africa, at least in Cameroon, which most people could afford, are Chinese made and from Huawei. So some of these debates, people are feeling like we don't exactly understand because it's also really mainly a matter of cost. When products come from Asia, from China, from India to Africa, they tend to be closer to how much people can pay for them than coming from the West. So this debate, for example, seems like a foreign debate, whether you choose Huawei or you go with Western companies seen from Africa. Other debates sound like a déjà vu. So the latest one being, especially from the West, especially from the US, the intrusion of foreign countries into the electoral process using the internet. When you're sitting in an African country, you feel like you have seen this before in your elections without the use of the internet, in fact, long before the internet came. So it seems to be a new debate, but actually an old debate, because many of these countries have experienced the immixtion of foreign countries into their democratic processes. Now, what is new might be that soon after the revelation in 2016 that U.S. elections were subjected to probable attacks from a foreign power, there was also news, in fact, a few months ago, that in a few elections in Africa, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the exact same thing may have happened using Facebook and Twitter. So we already see these trends we see in the West at play in Africa. The particular worry in the context of Africa is that even less than in the US or in countries like India, cybersecurity is probably at the lowest levels. So systems are more vulnerable to such attacks. And the potential, therefore, of harm to the political process, it's enormous. And yes, those debates, therefore, attract attention. I'm not sure that policymakers are really taking the measures they should probably be taking, or at least seeing what they can do. But I know that in one instance, at least in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the last elections where they were using electronic voting, there was a lot of debate about how safe can we make the system to be. So they decided that they will use those machines to record the votes, but they won't use them to transmit them. They won't connect them to the internet so that they might be less vulnerable to any attack. It means people are aware, but it's a serious debate, which I'm not sure they have figured out a response to, but at the same time, in countries like the US, they have not figured out a response yet. So yes, that's what I have to say about those the perspective from a number of African countries.
It's quite fascinating to see the parallels with India's case, in a sense that you know that there is some sort of clearly there are actors who are interested in influencing the election, but you don't see policymakers necessarily getting on top of it. And the parallels are quite extraordinary. As I think more and more about TikTok, for example, exploding in both Africa and India, mobile phone usage blowing up in both. The parallels are quite deep and striking. So the last set of questions that I had are basically to understand a little more about how technology authoritarianism might be panning out in Africa. Now, in India, for example, most recently we're having some pretty serious debates about the way that facial ID might be used and individual rights and so on and so forth. What kind of debates are we seeing in Africa? What is your broad prognosis for what we might see over the next few years?
My sense and my fear when I follow the debates around the use of the internet in Africa, the political debate, is that it's often under the covert of national security debates. Unfortunately, every time you're talking national security, you're talking secrecy. You are not in a real debate, you are in decisions being made by people who believe that they have to make hard decisions. So as a result, what you have on the ground is really countries that view the use of technologies as potentially damaging or already damaging take the steps to stop and reduce or frame what should and can happen online. They put taxation on the use of social media. We've seen the case in Uganda, Tanzania, and a host of other countries in recent months. In my home country, where there is something of a civil war going on in part of the country, the government has taken to upping its effort on surveillance and interpreting existing criminal law in a very expensive way to cover hate speech. So the debate, as seen as an exchange between people with different views and knowledge of policies and care of human rights and others, is not really taking place. It's more a rush to policy making to address a crisis situation. That's what you see when the government feels threatened, and you see that in a handful of countries,
including India, unfortunately.
You see it. In fact, it's stressing. It's stressful. We have to remind that even in the U.S., thanks to Snowden, we learn what the government of a democracy, proud democracy, was doing behind the backs of its citizens, so to speak.
The leader of the free world.
Exactly. And now you also have the interesting case of countries which have a relatively good experiment with democracy and where you see freedoms being guaranteed. And I'm thinking here of Kenya, of South Africa, of the Seychelles, where there is an acceptance of openness and there are debates among MPs and with advocates, with civil society organizations about how to go in balancing privacy, the need for privacy and security and other aspects that are important. But I fear much of the debate has really been a secondary element of the wider debate on national security in the time of crisis, and the laws adopted and the laws being discussed are really laws that will make the internet less affordable to many people, less free, and it's my prognostic at this point. I'm not sure, but I think we'll see this very varied trend continuing in various countries in Africa. The good news is the internet and all these new technologies are faster than policymakers usually realize and get time to deal with. So I keep hoping that because of all the good things the internet brings, by the time policymaker gets their mind around what they're trying to do, certain things will have become just obvious, and you can't step back from them. I mean, when you think, for example, of the way we all use the internet these days, how we communicate with each other, I don't see easily how a government can decide, for example, that for us to be communicating through WhatsApp, because I'm in Africa and you're in India, we will need to pay a tax in addition to that. There are efforts to do such a thing, but the fact that we have already been using it for free and other social media platforms,
so that's the norm now.
I hope it becomes harder to just clamp down on all of us, because it will be a denial and we will be reneging on the promises of what the internet can bring.
What a wonderful thought. On that note, sir, thank you so much for joining us. It's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you for listening to All Things Policy. Do follow All Things Africa. Check out Mr. Essoungou's writing on the United Nations website. And thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey guys, this is me, Eva Bhatt, your host for the podcast 9XM Soundcast. This podcast is produced by India's largest music network, 9X Media. We have been catering music and you have been enjoying. And now we bring you a podcast where music inspires. Every week, I interact with some of the best minds from the music industry to understand their creative discipline. Every new episode will feature artists who will share inspiring notes from their journey, some valuable tips for budding artists. So do subscribe to the podcast where music inspires. Enjoy a brand new episode of 9XM Soundcast every Tuesday on IVM Podcast app or website or wherever you get your podcast from.
Hi guys, this is Ayushi.
And I am Ritasha.
And welcome to Agla Station Adulthood.
It's a fun podcast we've got going on and we'd love for you to tune in and enjoy with us.
Join us as we stop at various stations and discuss different topics that seem to be bothering us and hopefully
Dating,
you as well.
relationships, beauty, just being an adult, lots of different things.
We don't have a great grip on it, but we've done okay so far.
Catch Agla Station Adulthood every Thursday on the IVM app, the IVM website, or wherever else you get your podcasts.